everybody, I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be doing a tutorial as well as a speed paint. So of course the very first step we need to do is get our sketch down. I find that if you keep it nice and loose, it makes it a lot easier to edit, and it just kind of helps you get a nice natural flow and makes your drawing less stiff. So next we're going to be working on inking. Now a couple of things to keep in mind with inking is weight as well as distance. Since we're not really dealing with distance in this drawing, we're going to talk more about weight. A good rule of thumb is to remember that the thicker and heavier an object is, the thicker and heavier the line art should be. And the thinner something is, the thinner the line art should be. However, you don't really want your lining to be all one weight, so something else you should keep in mind whenever you're inking is your shadows and your light source. So if you notice in this drawing, there are going to be areas where I have the line art much thicker and some areas where I have it much thinner. I like to put these dark spots of shadows in areas where the light source isn't going to hit, and then I like to make sure that my lines are nice and thin in areas where the light source is the strongest. Now, as I mentioned earlier, weight also plays a very important role whenever it comes to inking. If you notice in this particular drawing, I don't use a lot of wrinkles because of the weight of the fabric. The thicker the fabric, the fewer the wrinkles you want to use, and the thinner the fabric, the more wrinkles. Whenever you're inking hair, the thickness or the thinness of the lines can really heavily depend on the texture, the style, as well as the thickness of the hair. For this character, I want to make sure that her hair looks nice and fluffy, so I'm going to be using a lot of thin line art for this particular piece. I'm also going to make sure to put these tiny pools of shadows in areas where the hairs connect or they touch. Adding these little pools of shadow also help just convey more weight as well as give it a bit more dimension. Something else you can do to give it a little bit more detail and a little bit more volume is to have the hair overlapping each other. However, whenever you do this method, you want to make sure that the hair is all going in the same direction as the part would be. This really helps give the hair a more natural flow, and it also gives it a sense of movement. Another small detail that you can add to give the hair a little bit more depth is to add these small lines that go in the same direction as the hair. A lot of people may be very tempted to draw hair in individual strands. However, it's not really an efficient way to draw hair. A better and much easier method is to take the hair and to divide it into different sections. With this particular drawing, you can see that I've actually divided this hair into 3 different sections: the bangs, the sides, and the back. By dividing the hair into these big sections, I'm able to really focus on the shape as well as the movement of the hair, and I'm able to focus on just the details in that one section. Even with realistic styles, it's typically a better idea to draw the hair into big basic shapes and then build on top of those shapes. One of my favorite acronyms to always remember when I'm drawing is KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. I find it to be a very important principle that you should apply to art because sometimes less is more. Oftentimes putting in too much detail into a certain area can actually detract from the rest of the drawing and become a big distraction for the viewer. When it comes to coloring hair, there are several different methods that you can use. For this particular piece, I used a big airbrush and I applied the color in areas where I felt like the hair would naturally curve. After applying the gradients, I then decided to go in and I started cutting out the shapes using an eraser. I find that by doing this method, it's actually much easier and faster since you're not focusing on coloring each individual section and you're just getting it done in one large area. Once my first layer of shadows are done, I'm going to go in with another color, this time more of a purplish blue, and I'm going to put in secondary shadows as well. Typically, I like to put anywhere between 2 to 4 different layers of shadows, just kind of depending on the level of detail I'm wanting to put into that character. After some color edits, I'm going to go in and I'm going to start putting in even more shadows. Instead of using a darker blue or green, I'm actually going to be using a pink for this particular piece. The reason I'm choosing pink instead of darker blues or greens is because pink is a complementary tone to green. Using complementary colors instead of using the same color on a multiply mode is actually going to give it a lot more depth, and it's going to create a very nice dynamic between all of the other colors and make them really pop. Color theory is a really integral part to understanding how colors work as a whole and understanding what colors do and don't work together. A large part of art isn't just drawing repetitively, but it's also studying, and one thing I always recommend people to study is color theory. Studying and understanding color theory can make a huge difference on your art, and it can really bring your colors to the next level. Once our shadows are done, we're going to start putting in our highlights. For highlights, I highly recommend to not use white, as oftentimes white can actually take away from the color. It's also very important to keep in mind where your light source is, as well as how the hair curves. Now that we have our hair done, we're going to start focusing on the shadows of the face. Since bright white does take away from the colors, I oftentimes will use a yellowish white or a bluish white instead for the teeth and the eyes. I already did this step much earlier, but the first thing I actually do with skin is I'll use an airbrush and I'll go in and I'll put blush in certain areas like the cheeks, the nose, and the fingers. For this character, since she has a pink undertone, we're going to keep using reds and bright pinks for our primary shadows. Next, using a big soft airbrush, we're going to just buff out these shadows a little bit to soften them. Using the same blue from the bottom of the hair, we're going to go in and we're going to apply these in certain areas of the shadows. For the highlights on the skin, we're also going to use the same color from the highlights on the hair. By using the same colors in the hair, it creates this nice bounce light effect. For the sweater, we're going to go in and we're going to put in these nice big chunky shapes to show where we want our shadows to be. To make sure that our sweater looks soft, we want to make sure to avoid any harsh edges. Shadows can also be used to give things form and shape. Instead of applying the shadows in a realistic manner with this drawing, I decided to use them more to shape the sweater and give it more dimension. Sometimes it's better to go with something that looks more aesthetically pleasing instead of something that looks realistic. For our second layer of shadows, we're going to redefine certain areas where we put our first layer, and we're also going to apply them in areas where the light hits the least. Using that same bright green like we did with the skin, we're going to go in and we're going to start applying our highlights. We're going to add texture here and there just to give it a little bit more depth. Since this fabric isn't very reflective, we're going to bring the opacity down on this quite a lot. After making more adjustments, we're going to go in and we're going to kind of fix our highlights on the face. For a more aesthetic look, I decided to put in some Rembrandt lighting. I also applied a bright pink color to the edges of the highlights to give a light scattering effect on the skin. After some color adjustments and adding some background elements, I noticed that the face wasn't quite how I wanted it to be, so I used the liquify tool to make adjustments. For finishing touches, you can add small strands of hair as well as some texturing just to give it a nice polished look. And with those final details added, this piece is now finished. Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked my content, please like and subscribe.